A 14-year-old Palestinian girl stabbed an Israeli woman yesterday in a disputed East Jerusalem neighbourhood. Israeli police have reported this. Now, Mariah Chopra was stabbed in the back, was stabbed in the back as she was walking her children to school in what was the 6th Palestinian attack in Jerusalem in just 3 weeks.
Yes, Cohen and her family are among the few Jewish residents of Sheikh Jarrah, where a pro-settler Israeli organisation has been attempting for years to evict Palestinian residents. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has said in a tweet, Israel will not allow terrorism to raise its head.
Well, spokesperson for the Israeli embassy, Ohad Zemet, is with us now. Thank you very much for taking the time to come into the studio for us today. It does look like a terrifying upturn in violence domestically against Israeli citizens.
First of all, thank you for having me. We saw in the last 3 weeks, I think, as you mentioned, 6 attacks. We saw just yesterday a 14-year-old trying to stab a woman walking with her kids. We saw a person, I think it was a few days ago, looking for a visibly Jewish person and start stabbing him. We saw the video. And the reason behind this is incitements. We see on social media, we see groups like Hamas, this jihadi group who wants to replace Israel with an Islamic State, advocating for violence, advocating for glorifying the martyrdom. And this is a problem we all need to tackle, because it's not only in Israel, it's not only in the Middle East. Now with social media, it's everywhere.
But you have been condemned, the Israeli government has been condemned by both US President Joe Biden and the UN for your policy against the Palestinian. And in fact, the UN says Israeli settlements are the engine of the occupation, and that they're basically trampling upon the fundamental precepts of humanitarian and human rights. So there is lots of condemnation about how the Israeli government is treating the Palestinians as well.
A 14-year-old child, or we can say child, that takes a knife and stabs a woman walking with her kids. It's not, and he doesn't want to make peace. It's not an issue of of having dialogue, of having a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's purely incitement, purely what they see in social media. And actually, you see in Jerusalem people, hitting Jewish people and posting this on TikTok, and then sharing this with their friends. And we saw here also in London, we saw in recently as May, during the conflict in Gaza, we saw people in front of the Israeli embassy burning Israeli flags. We saw just next to my house a convoy of people chanting death to Jews. And we saw in Oxford Street last week, people throwing shoes and spitting on kids that are visibly Jewish. This is not, here is London. This is not, it's not Israel. And we saw also people, saw the stabbing in London Bridge, it was 2 years ago. People are, it's our way of life, and that is threatening to this jihadi group. It's not the issue of a peaceful resolution. They don't want Israel in any borders, I think.
And you touched on something now that I wanted to bring up anyway, so we might as well go down that route now, which is, in my consideration anyway, what appears to be a worrying upturn in anti-Semitism on the streets of Britain, especially around areas of North London, for example, or indeed Oxford Street, as you said. What do you think is fueling that?
As I said, we have now, now with social media, we have ideology, radical ideology, from the Middle East. It doesn't stay there. It migrates, and you saw people, consuming, they don't consume the normal, specifically young people, they don't consume normal British television. They consume social media.
Sorry to interrupt, just quickly, do you think that other forms of racism are treated more seriously than anti-Semitism in this country specifically as well?
I don't want to I'm a diplomat. I don't want to pass any judgment on the British government. What I can say is that we work together with the British government, specifically on anti-Semitism and also on tackling terrorism. We just saw, I think it was a few weeks ago, we saw the British government prescribing Hamas in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And this is a major step in fighting terrorism, also in fighting anti-Semitism. I think the British government is really pushing forward on this, because anti-Semitism, it's not only a problem of Israel, it's not only a problem of the Jewish people, it's a problem for every society. Every society, and what starts with the Jews don't end with the Jews. So we need to tackle.
And the violence that we are seeing, as you allude to there, it's a problem for everybody in Israel. It's not just specific to those particular groups, those ethnic groups, etc. What is the Israeli government doing now to make sure that this violence doesn't continue and actually that all people in the country can be kept safe and the violence can be curbed?
So first of all, the Israeli police is trying its best in order to monitor, in order to safeguard people, because it's not only violence against, as I said, violence as violence, it's not good, and they need to police the situation. Also, in terms of incitement, which I can say the Israeli, in the educational system and in the media, tries to advocate for more peaceful dialogue, more integration with our population within Israel. There is a lot of good initiatives of bringing people together. I think this is what we need to do against people who try to advocate for hate and violence.
In your opinion, or indeed the Israeli government's opinion, what would the Palestinian people have to do, the Palestinian government have to do, for you to now consider that was grounds for completely good relations? So basically, to stop an end of the tit for tat that's been going on relentlessly now for a very long time. What movement would you have to see from the Palestinians?
I think, first of all, a change of discourse. Israeli policy has always been, we want peace. We want to go to the negotiating table and try to create a better future for us. The recent agreements we had with the Arab states, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, we see a trend in the region, a trend in the Middle East of bringing people together. And you see, on the other hand, by the way, in the Middle East, you see radical groups led by Iran with their jihadi ideology, who wants to bring the region backwards. Instead of bringing people together, instead of dialogue, they advocate for violence, not only against Israel, also against, American forces, we see British forces. So it's very much a way of speaking, of dialogue. This is what we want.
Do you not think it's disingenuous, though, to suggest the violence is all coming from one side entirely, and to suggest that the Israeli state, its only sort of purpose and its only approach has been one of dialogue?
I think that we have a conflict with the Palestinians, and it's not new. It's a conflict for more than 100 years. In every time we try to sit and negotiate, we had people coming and trying to break it with violence. Specifically, I have to say, in the 90s, when the peace process was in its peak, we saw Hamas groups blowing up buses, etc. I think the majority of the people in Israel don't want violence. I think the Israeli government, we are a democratic country. It's not that the state is trying to create violence or to do something. We try to police the situation. And Jerusalem is a very hard area to police, I have to say, when you have all these groups, using, religion, and it's a very tight environment.
I can imagine. Well, look, thank you so much for coming in, and obviously, hopefully, the situation in Israel does just calm down, to say the least, and hopefully we can meet up again soon. It'll be great to speak to you again. Spokesperson for the Israeli Embassy, Ohad Zemet, there, who was in the studio just reacting to an uptick in violence in Israel, but also discussing, of course, the wider situations and, as we spoke about last week, anti-Semitism on the streets of Britain as well.
Yes, indeed.